Since the birth of modern democracy, many people have sacrificed their freedom to change their country's story. However, only a few of them were able to rise to the position of commander-in-chief. In today's episode, we look at an ex-convict who rose to become president of the republic. Fidel Castro of Cuba. Castro was born in August 1926 in Biran, Cuba. His father was a war veteran and migrant to Cuba from Galicia in northwestern Spain. His mother was a Canarian woman who worked as a domestic servant for Castro's father and later became his mistress and later his second wife. From the age of 6, Castro was sent to live with his teacher. At 19, he was enrolled at the University of Havana. Instead of studying law, Castro was deeply invested in student activism and violent gangsterism on campus. Castro became very critical of the corruption of the Cuban government. When he received death threats, he started carrying a gun and surrounding himself with a group of armed friends. At 21, Castro joined an expedition to overthrow Rafael Trujillo's government in the Dominican Republic. Upon his return, he assumed the leading role in all student protests in Havana. In July 1952, Castro formed a group called the Movement, which recruited revolutionary fighters from Havana's poorest districts. Within a year, he had over 1,200 followers. In July 1953, Castro gathered 165 of his revolutionaries and launched an attack on Moncada, a military barracks outside Santiago de Cuba. They met with fierce resistance. Castro's side suffered 6 dead and 15 wounded, while the army suffered 19 dead and 27 wounded. Castro was later arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, Cuban President Batista didn't see Castro as much of a threat. As such, he ordered his release after 2 years in jail, a very big mistake. Castro immediately traveled to Mexico, where he met Che Guevara, who ran a series of successful military campaigns, which eventually led to the fall of Batista's regime in 1959. José Miro Cardona became Prime Minister of Cuba, a post he held for only a month and resigned. Fidel Castro took over as Prime Minister at the age of 32. He was Prime Minister for 17 years and President for 32 years. Please do not forget to give us a like and subscribe to our channel. Nelson Mandela of South Africa. Mandela was born in July 1918 in South Africa's Cape Province. In his early years, he was given the nickname Rolihlahla, meaning troublemaker. Still, he was later referred to by his clan name Madiba. In 1937, he attended a Methodist college in Fort Beaufort, where the schoolmasters emphasized the superiority of European culture. In contrast, Mandela was mainly interested in native African culture. In 1939, when he moved to the University of Fort Hare to study politics and native administration, there he made friends who had connections at the African National Congress, the ANC, which stood up for an independent South Africa from the British Empire. By the age of 23, he had become actively involved in the ANC movement. He was an executive member of the party's Youth League. In the South African general elections of 1948, in which only whites were allowed to vote, the Nationalist Party took power. In their effort to enforce racial segregation, they implemented the new apartheid legislation. On June 22, 1952, Mandela addressed a crowd of over 10,000 people to launch a non-violence campaign against apartheid. In response, the apartheid government introduced the 1953 Public Safety Act, banning public appearances by ANC members. Worse, they ordered the relocation of all black people from Sophiatown suburb to Johannesburg. ANC militants resorted to violence, bombing many government buildings and power stations. On June 12, 1964, Mandela and 2 other activists were convicted for planning guerrilla warfare against the government and sentenced to life in prison. They spent 18 years in the Robben Island prison and were transferred to Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town in 1982 and to Victor Verster Prison in 1988. However, the 1980s witnessed an escalation of free Mandela protests and violence all over the country. Also, economic depression was looming, as many multinationals had stopped investing in South Africa on ethical grounds. As a result, the Nationalist Party's new leader held a cabinet meeting and pointed out that apartheid was no longer sustainable. He therefore proposed the immediate release of Mandela and other ANC detainees. After a series of deliberations and closed-door meetings, Mandela was released on February 11, 1990, after spending 27 years in prison. With the end of the apartheid, the first multiracial general elections were scheduled for April 1994. The ANC, represented by Mandela, won 63% of the votes. Mandela became South Africa's first black president on May 10, 1994. Thank you for watching, and do well to check out our next video right here.